This is the World Unpacked. I'm Doug Farrer, and welcome back to the show. Today we're talking about the Indian Ocean. There are dozens of small island nations, but also big players like France, the UK, China, India, and the United States, who all have huge interest in the Indian Ocean. Many of these countries have very well-developed policies and very strategic and intentional activities in this region in order to engage with these nations. But the United States is behind the ball. Sure, recently they renamed the Pacific Command to Indo-PACOM as an effort to show how serious they are about security issues in the region. But beyond that, of the 36 nations that either border or are in the Indian Ocean, only 19 of them have U.S. ambassadors. We often forget that the Indian Ocean region is such a vital artery for global trade, setting aside the security competition. Some 80% of all the maritime oil flows through the Indian Ocean, traversing strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. And these small island nations have huge problems with climate change, as rising sea level threatens their very existence. President Biden is on the verge of taking his first trip to Asia, but that's not what got me so interested in this. What got me so interested in this topic to begin with is my colleague Darshana Baruah. She's a fellow in Carnegie's South Asia program and recently developed a digital interactive map, which we'll put in the show notes, and you should definitely go check out. This map shows trade routes, points of conflict, and different important elements that come together to make this region so important. I'm looking forward to talking about all these key issues with her. Here we go. So Darshana, why did you get so interested in the Indian Ocean to begin with?
Well, I was interested in maritime security issues, and I did my master's thesis on the South China Sea at that point in time. But in India, there was nobody looking at maritime security issues or even Indian Ocean because it didn't really have that much of competition. But historically, when you look back, and I'm a history student, I did my undergrad in history, Indian Ocean was a very important space. And when I connected the dots, it was almost like every power that has wanted to be a dominant power, a maritime power, has had a big focus on the Indian Ocean. So in my understanding and in my studies, I found it, how are we not paying attention to this region? But at that point, there wasn't anything happening. Conflict is something that grabs headlines, and there was no conflict, there was no competition at that point. So forget the rest of the world. Even in India, there wasn't much attention on the Indian Ocean as such. But as I did my thesis on South China Sea, that was 2012, when things were beginning to get a little controversial. It was getting heated. It was getting a lot of traction. And I thought that, if China's larger global ambition is to be a maritime power, and just like every other maritime power through history, they would have to come out into the Indian Ocean as well. So it was that I thought, it was the hypothesis that China's road to being a global power is also steeped in its ambition to be a maritime power. And for that, it would have to secure the Indian Ocean region. And that is why I started exploring it.
I think you pointed to what's so interesting about the Indian Ocean as a topic of study, which is that it's vitally important, but also kind of a forgotten or perhaps divided or balkanized area of work for policymakers of major powers in that region. So I do want to talk about those big powers and those big players that are present in the Indian Ocean. And I want to start with France. Can you tell us about France's objectives in the Indian Ocean?
Yeah, so when I actually moved to Washington, and I would have conversations about the Indian Ocean, they would say, well, of course, India is a key player. Who are the other ones? And I would be like, France. And there was always a bit of surprise element, like, how come France? What is France doing in the Indian Ocean region? But France's own Indo-Pacific strategy or its own maritime strategies always focuses quite a bit on Indian Ocean and the Pacific because they have territories in both the oceans. It unfortunately stems from colonial period and also France's own ambitions or its own empire and being maritime power at that point in time. They've retained some of those. France has, I think, about 1 million citizens in the Indian Ocean region, even though it's not. Even though France is not on the Indian Ocean coast, they're very, very interested in that. France is one country that looks at the Indian Ocean region from where African coast is very much part of the Indian Ocean region because of their interest, presence, engagements, and regional sort of conversations with different African nations. But they do divide the Indian Ocean region into the Eastern Indian Ocean and Western Indian Ocean, and they don't tend to come that much into the Eastern Indian Ocean. So France is very much a big player in the region because of its engagement in the African coast. It has bases in the region. It has military presence in Reunion, Mayotte. It has a lot of territories. But that map will show you the islands and territories that France has in the region, which helps understand and imagine why France is present in the region and how they call themselves an Indian Ocean player, if not a power.
Okay, let's keep moving. What about the United Kingdom?
Well, United Kingdom, it used at one point the entire Indian Ocean was referred to as the British Lake because of their presence and control across the area. The entire I think the entire thesis was based on the fact that they could control the sea lines of communications in the Indian Ocean region through ports and bases, which were at that point colonies, whether all the islands were part of British colonies. They were able to manage their transits and routes across the Indian Ocean region. So at one point, the British were the dominant player in the Indian Ocean region. They had a strategy of defense strategy and defending bases in the area all the way to Maldives, and of course they were based in India as well. When they took the decision around late 60s, early 70s, kind of to withdraw east of Suez, which was really withdraw all the way from Southeast Asia, they disappeared from the region in the sense that they were after years and centuries of being present, being that dominant player, Britain decided to focus more in waters closer to their home, but for strategic importance and for friendships and allies in the region, it maintains some places. One of that is what they call is British Indian Ocean territory, within which is the Chagos Archipelago, within which is Diego Garcia, one of the contentions and disputes that exist in the region today.
Okay, moving on. What about India? Obviously, a central point in the Indian Ocean. What are their objectives for their Indian Ocean policy?
For India, it's home base. The Indian Navy considers the entire Indian Ocean as the home base, but India too also divides it into Eastern Indian Ocean and Western Indian Ocean. India inherited a lot of the maritime advantages from the British Navy and from the British, but the main priority for all players is securing key lines of communication, because transit global trade still today happens. The bulk of it happens through sea. It's maritime borne, it's sea-borne, and a lot of it goes through the Indian Ocean region. And for India also, it is through its energy lines run through the Indian Ocean region to the Gulf, and the ability to sort of protect those sea lines of communications is one key objective. The second is also it's the theater, is the domain through which India engages with countries across the region, whether if you want to engage with Mauritius, if you want to engage with Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Maldives, go to the Gulf, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea. In ocean dominance was important during conflicts with Pakistan. So different areas, that's the domain, that's the base, and I think that's been the objective, to secure it for its own strategic interest for India.
Okay, one of the most important players, and probably the one who's generating so much interest from U.S. policymakers, certainly, is China. Can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese engagement with the Indian Ocean and what their objectives are, both military, trade?
Yeah, and I think like every other country interested in the Indian Ocean region, China's interests also come from the need to secure its own sea lines of communication, its trade and energy routes. One of the biggest challenges that China has talked about and continues to talk about is Malacca dilemma, that the Straits of Malacca is so narrow and so dense, but it's the route to Chinese trade and energy routes from Middle East to Beijing, and in the event of they have a concern that in the event of a conflict or in the event of a war, that those straits could be blocked off either by the United States Navy or by Indian Navy, or in collaboration between US and its friends, and that would choke off Chinese supply lines, energy supply lines at that point in time. So for China too, similar to the UK, similar to every other, I think the Portuguese, the French, and the other European countries who have sought to dominate a particular area, who sought to be kind of be a maritime player, be a global player, it has had to come out into the maritime domain. And for China, it would be the same.
Let's wrap up with the United States. What are their objectives in the region?
US also has been present for a long time, and it took on a more concrete role after the after the British withdrew from the region and through the Cold War period. But it's also, again, it's a key transit route for engagements in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Gulf and the entire area, which is why they have the base in Diego Garcia and presence across or around the area.
So we've talked about great power conflict in the Indian Ocean, but there are plenty of island nations and territories there who have their own objectives. Can you tell us a little bit about what these island states might share as far as objectives in the competition between France, the US, China, and India?
Today, as a new sort of competition comes out, it's not just US and China. You also have former colonies which did not have a say or agency, like India becoming a competitor in this dynamic. But the other angle is also, for the first time, islands have agency. For the first time, their voices are going to have an impact. They can have a say. How they interact with which player, in what manner, in what team, has an impact on how those great players talk to each other because of the geography, because of the location. So islands have gained that agency, and they're looking to certainly, make sure that they don't become what you said at the beginning. When the elephants fight, it impacts the grass they're fighting on. So they want to make sure that it does not end up intensifying military competition in the area that impacts their own interests. Their interest is they want the region to be secure. They don't want any of this competition to spill into their internal political dynamics, but also to shore what is the best way to secure their strategic interests while the big guys are fighting. Because I think there's a realization and acknowledgement that big players will compete and they will have that competition flowing out into the region over periods of decades, regardless of what the littorals or the small islands will say, because countries act as their national interest dictates. So their national interest is to say, like, to protect and secure their interest and their political interest, security interest, defense interest. But I think the thing that is shaping up to be a little different is that earlier the islands' interest probably did not have that much of an impact that it can have today, because of them being sovereign nations, a vote each at the United Nations, a member of the international community, and players that can actually shape this great power competition. That sort of an agency perhaps the region did not see before. So even if the Indian Ocean or, say, the Indo-Pacific goes through similar wheels of contention and competition, the conversation is bound to be different, because the players and the ability of small states having that impact on larger players is significantly different today than it was ever before.
So let's stick with this. Last month, China inked a deal with the Solomon Islands, which didn't have a lot of details, except basically that Beijing is offering to send security forces to maintain stability on the islands, as well as possibly refuel their ships. Is this an example of that agency? And how was this deal received by the other big players in the region?
Well, I mean, the few countries that have been more vocal about the deal, like Australia, New Zealand, United States, who see it as a direct threat to their national interests or their security environment. But you're right, this is the show of that agency, right? Because Solomon Islands have the agency to make a deal with whether that deal is good, bad for the region. You have that conversation, but they can make that deal as sovereign nation, and that impacts the entire region. It impacted the region enough for United States to send Kurt Campbell within 48 hours to the region, right?
Two top officials, too late to stop Beijing's deal, but attempting to prevent relations with China from getting too cozy.
We just had a very good meeting, and we had a nice set of exchanges with the Prime Minister and his team. It's just wonderful to be back in the Solomons. Thank you.
When was the last time Washington had sent a delegation with such short notice? So you have enough of an agency to warrant a reaction from a bigger power that has probably ignored the region for ages. Secretary Blinken went to, I think, Fiji in February of 2022. It was the first time Secretary of State from the US had gone in 37 years. What was Washington doing for almost 4 decades? That's even if you end up sending high-level delegations today, and even if there's an intention to engage with them, there is a recognition and acknowledgement that this interest itself is a reaction to China's interest. So I'm not sure how much actually countries or governments across the region, whether it's Canberra, whether it's Washington, Tokyo, Paris, or Delhi, is is securing their own interests. Because if you're only going to react to a Chinese presence in the region, if you're only going to craft up a strategy as a response to China building a base or creating a defense engagement, then you're also just providing incentives to say that, okay, if you want my attention, first grab China's attention.
So how will this deal impact the regional balance of power?
That is an interesting question, because it will have regional impact, right? Historically, Solomon Islands has been a key point at the campaign of Guadalcanal. It was key in terms of turning the tide towards the United States Navy against Japan during World War II. So geographically, it's very important. It's very close to Australia. It sits within the route. It places, say, if China is present in Solomon Islands, it's sitting between Australia and the United States. It's sitting between Australia and Hawaii. So it's sitting between, it's sitting on a route that the US ships would have to go in its engagement, not just with Australia, but also to Southeast Asia. So strategically, it's very important. But while we discuss the security implications for the region of a deal like this, I think it's also important to recognize that this is reflective of how regions, islands, and littorals have been feeling about the traditional players for decades in the region, and this applies to the Indian Ocean as well.
China is closer, and I expect their trading relationships with these islands is greater than that of the United States. They're also being very assertive, the Chinese, all over the world, but especially in the near seas to this area. In that context, does the United States have anything that they can offer or any points of leverage that would give them a chance to get back into the game with respect to engaging with these vital islands in the Indian Ocean?
They may not have been missing, but they've been sleeping. They've certainly been sleeping for decades, right? So now the question is, so the interest, say, is not new. Now the question is, how do we re-engage with the region? How do you craft policies? How do you come up with answers to these issues? First is to actually recognize the damage caused from being absent from the region for so many years, right? And what was the driving point that allowed the United States to come back to the region or say we are interested? Is the United States saying that the red line is China building a defense cooperation? Is that what you're saying? That is the red line, and that is the only thing that is going to warrant enough of a reaction from United States to send a delegation or to say that we're interested in a region? If that is the red line, it's a dangerous red line, because then you're saying that the region is not important to me unless there's a probability of China building something there or China having a defense engagement with it, which also means that United States Indo-Pacific strategy is pinned on what China does. That means you will continue to chase Chinese projects, Chinese initiatives, Chinese engagement. So the country chasing it does not have a larger strategy or a vision on what it seeks to do. Its vision is pinned on the fact that you want to limit Chinese presence, but you're not sure of what Chinese vision's taking you to. So it's kind of sort of like a chasing game, and you'll run out of your resources and capabilities faster than what it's going to be. So I think the goal should be in defining what, of course, acknowledging China as the competition, because that is not going away, that will stay. But in defining and acknowledging what the interest and priorities in the region are.
When we come back, I'll ask Darshana about the upcoming Quad meeting that will take place in Tokyo during President Biden's South Korea-Japan trip and the overall U.S. strategy for the region. Hey, thanks for listening to the show. Are you looking for another great podcast? Let me recommend Aaron David Miller's Carnegie Connects. Carnegie Connects is our premier live podcast, and Aaron hosts big names from secretaries of state to CNN frontline reporters each week. Be sure to look up Carnegie Connects on any podcast platform. Now, let's get back to the episode. I want to talk about the Quad because in Washington, at least, I think there's some people here who think of the Quad as like a proto-Asian NATO, and other people who say, look, these four countries, they don't agree on anything. They got together to help respond to a disaster in 2004, and not much has changed since. So how do you think about the Quad as a multilateral vehicle for U.S. engagement in the region?
I think first, just to put it like, I don't think so Quad is or will be an Asian NATO, but it is interesting to see a lot of countries, in fact, even European countries refer to Quad as, a quasi kind of like an Asian NATO structure. But that is one thing perhaps that the four countries have tried to stay away from. And the last summit that happened in September, which was also the first Quad summit, they went in they took a lot of effort in making sure that it has nothing to do on the providing itself as a military or a security vehicle to solve its own personal issues with China or other competitors in the region. But Quad, I see Quad as one of the many unilaterals and multilateral institutions, organizations, vehicles, and platforms in the Indo-Pacific. Like I said, the Indo-Pacific is vast, and every country has different partners in different parts of the Indo-Pacific to address different issues. For example, I see India partnering more closely and more effectively, say, with France on the Indian Ocean region within its Indo-Pacific strategy, perhaps with Japan to work more with Southeast Asia, perhaps with Australia and kind of Bay of Bengal area, perhaps with US on different issues, on its own needs for its navy. So everyone has different partners and players in the region, and Quad is one of those unilaterals and multilaterals. There are multiple others. There are trilateral trilateral forums and platforms and avenues.
If you look at the Quad countries, you've got the United States, Australia, Japan. All three of those are interested in balancing against China or even actively constraining China's aggressive push out into their region and really into the global economy and all sorts of different factors, tech, whatever. India are they the skunk at the party? I mean, is that why the Quad is such a limited enterprise? Because India can't even condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, let alone think about trying to be a counterweight to China along with the United States and those other two nations.
The Quad is, with the possible exception of India being somewhat shaky on some of this, but Japan has been extremely strong, so has Australia, in terms of dealing with Putin's aggression.
I think that's the general perception, that India is the weak link in the Quad, that a lot of hesitation comes from India. But if you go to Delhi, Delhi will tell you that initial hesitations came from Australia. Australia was the first one to walk out of it. So I think different capitals of the Quad nations will give you different perspectives and perceptions of it. On the question of Russia, I think the Indian External Affairs Minister, the Foreign Affairs Minister, talked about it at great length, both during the US-India 2+2 that happened earlier, and as well as the Raisina dialogue that happened in Delhi, when essentially, he was saying that India has been dealing with instability in its region and a lack of, the whole rules-based international order, where he was saying rules-based international order is not under threat for the first time. But when it was happening in Asia and away from, say, US and its partners and allies, areas of interest, nobody paid attention to it. So whether it is Afghanistan, whether it's India's own border tension with China. So India's view is that, that where the principles, values, and morals argument is something that Europe and its partners, friends, or say Washington uses when it's in its benefit, but not necessarily shows up for others in the region when it's happening to them. So it's a very, very practical decision for India in terms of how it can manage that relationship.
So India's relationship with Russia is complicated, but what about China?
One thing that India agrees with the other Quad countries is the threat from China. And that conversation was remarkably different, was changed in the summer of 2020 when Indian soldiers died from that armed conflict with China. And that made China a foreign policy conversation to a domestic election conversation in India. So now China is a conversation that is very dear and very important to the voting population in India. And I think that's a big change in India's outlook towards the area, towards China. I still don't think it's at the same level in terms of what it seeks to do because of a lot of reasons, because of its own geography, because of its own capabilities. But I do think that there are much more commonalities between India and the other three members of the Quad today than it was there even 5 years ago.
I want to touch on a deal that created a lot of drama in Washington and I think also in Paris, and that's the AUKUS deal, where the United States jumped in at the last minute to provide nuclear submarine technology to the Australians, and the Australians then ditched a contract they had with the French to build less powerful submarines.
France recalled its ambassador to the United States in protest over President Biden's decision to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia.
It was the biggest blow-up in Washington, Paris relations since the Iraq War, I would say here. And, the Washington, the capital renaming French fries freedom fries. I mean, it was really dramatic. I'm curious how the AUKUS deal was perceived in the Indo-Pacific region. A big deal, doesn't matter.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it was pretty dramatic, and there was a lot of different voices coming up from Paris, Canberra, and others. And I agree that it's a deal that is the whole. It's aimed at Australia building its capabilities in the region, and as a response to what it sees as a challenge that will only continue to grow, and it's necessary for the strategic environment. But I do also agree that it was not handled the best possible way that it could have been, and it undermined a lot of other initiatives in the region, including the India-France-Australia partnership, which I think was going to be one of those critical multilateral forums and avenues in the Indo-Pacific. In terms of responses from the region, there hasn't been. New Zealand actually came up, and I think one of the first ones to voice it, and then say, because they have a policy of no nuclear subs in Pacific waters. So New Zealand, despite being a member of the Five Eyes, was saying that, well, we continue with our policy, and I hope Australia and the others will respect it. But it was essential. But there was a general view was that there will be an intensification of competition between China and United States and its partners, and this will only continue to grow. It will only continue to gain more traction. I remember having this conversation at the Islands Forum, and one of the perspectives that came out was that, well, this also shows that it's not that there is no capital to be provided for strategic challenges. It's just that there's no capital for climate financing, but there is capital for, say, to build nuclear capabilities, right? And that was something that was voiced by a Pacific country when I asked about the AUKUS deal. How do you feel with it? Because you sit in the region and you are in the region. And I said, to me, the answer is that my takeaway is that, well, it's not a question of capabilities or not having the capital for it. The capital exists. It's just this is what the priority is. So I think it sends different kinds of messages also in terms of, and this I'm talking about from a island perspective or more of a small littoral nation perspective, and not necessarily a perspective of even, middle players, I think, as it goes. So there are different perspectives on the region, but it was not surprising to many. I didn't see any big opposition in a way to say, okay, this is just not acceptable. It was more about having that conversation, understanding that this will will increase these competitions, and also watching in terms of where governments are choosing to invest, which might not always align with the needs of their smaller regional partners.
So we talked a lot about priorities. You said Blinken visited the region, or Kurt Campbell visited the region because China did X, right? In this case, signed a deal with the Solomon Islands. There's clearly plenty of money for security initiatives like arming the Australians with nuclear-powered submarines, but much less intentional investment in infrastructure that might secure these island states against the ravages of climate change. So basically, from what I read it, the United States either has misprioritized potentially, or is just being reactive in their engagement with the region. If you were to brief President Biden on reprioritizing, what would you tell him to do?
I think the first thing I would say is to start showing up in the region again. Start showing back up in the region. Listen to the countries, listen to the players, what they're saying, because Washington's understanding of the region from policy papers that were written in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or even early 2000s are outdated. those conversations are not necessarily reflecting of what is happening in the region right now, right? So the first thing is, I would say, show back up into the region, start sending, whether it's through diplomatic missions, whether it's through delegation level visits, whether it is to win whatever means, whatever capacities it's possible, listen what is the region saying, and then craft your own policies in there. I'm not saying drop the ball on China, don't look at it from the China lens, but I'm also saying that don't look at it purely from the China lens, because that is not going to be a competition that Washington is going to be able to sustain. Nobody is going to be able to sustain that, because then you'll just keep chasing Chinese policies and you're not providing anything meaningful or sustainable at any level. And you're exhausting your limited resources, capabilities, and capacities. And every couple of years, you're changing your policies because you're trying to match someone else's policies. So I think the first thing is to show back up in the region, understand how the region sees the geopolitics of it, because sometimes we see the geopolitics of it very differently. The one thing I will say in terms of the China conversation is that the narrative is that China doesn't play by the rules. It does not respect international norms. It does not respect UN. So we are democratic countries. There's value in democracy. Of course there is. But there is also the other thing. China might be the assertive bully in the South China Sea, but China is a country with no territorial disputes in either South Pacific or the Indian Ocean region. So China is not always the bad guy. So not everybody is going to have the same perspective of China as Washington does, as Delhi does, as France does, as Tokyo does, and as Canberra does. And to be able to understand that perspective and to accept, acknowledge, and respect these sovereign voices, you have to show up first. So start showing up and then craft that policy.
Darshana, thank you so much for coming on the show, explaining this key region ahead of President Biden's trip. And we appreciate all your insights.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here again.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.